It's part 2 with the new Adam, the new Eve. And this time, new microphones on Spirit Spire, starting right now.
Broadcasting from the Cathedral of the Assumption in Louisville, Kentucky, this is Spirit and Spire. And now, here is your host.
Welcome back to another episode of Spirit and Spire. Today I'm your host, John Sohl. Joined with me, as per usual, we have our good friend, Isaac Fox.
Hello.
And we are very excited to delve into part 2 of Mary, the New Eve. And obviously we covered a lot of ground in our last episode.
Yeah.
Isaac, would you care to give us a bit of an overview of what we kind of discussed and then where we are now, and we'll launch back in?
It's like you're reading my mind. And I promise I didn't prepare that before, but I was kind of thinking along the same lines.
Yeah. So it's always good to do a little overview to kind of refresh, and then especially if anyone didn't watch that episode and they're kicking themselves in the pants for not, and now they need to go back and watch it.
Absolutely.
Give us a little bit of overview and then jump back into the depth.
And go watch part 1.
Right.
So, very quick overview. I'll try to do this as succinctly as possible. Something I'm not known for is being succinct, but no comments.
I'm in the same camp.
So we kind of started by saying that one of the many ways in which we view Mary in the church is as the new Eve, and this comes from the church fathers. This is one of the most common early traditions. So we were going to look into that. And the principle that we were laying down was, if we have a type in the Old Testament and a fulfillment of that in the New, then there should be certain points of similarity. So if we're going to see, okay, how is Mary the new Eve? We need to go back and look at the old Eve. And what we began doing was sort of listing bullet points of what we know about the first Eve. And we don't know a lot, right? I mean, it's pretty sparse. We have just a few passages that mention her, but they're so rich. Mm-hmm. And so the couple of points that we did mention last time was we began with the formation of Eve, or the woman, Isha in the Hebrew, who is formed from the side of the man, Adam, or Ish for the male. We'll talk about that later, I think.
Isha, right.
How he was put into a deep sleep, his side was opened, and the woman was formed from that. So
now, before he was put into the deep sleep, he was referred to as Adam. It was mankind in general, right? And only after he emerged was it Ish and Isha.
And I think, depending where we go, how far we get today, I think the whole what's in a name question could be really important. So hopefully we can dig into that a little bit, because I think it's very profound. The names for Adam, Eve, man, woman, really, really important.
And that connects to our names, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Is your name Eve?
No, our own names, the sacredness of our names,
yes,
the choice that our parents give by nature of our baptism as well as our birth, and there's something to our own name. So.
I knew what you meant. I was being intentionally obtuse.
Okay, I'm done with you. Get out of here.
So this talks about the formation of the woman, right?
Right.
And we talked about how that connects, and the church fathers have spoke of this also, to the formation of Christ's bride, because Christ is a new Adam. We have to see all of this in light of Christ being the new Adam. He is put into the deep sleep of death on the cross. The spear pierces his side is opened, and from that flows the elements which purify us so that he can now have his bride. And this is a real connection. Like, think of the Eucharist, right? It's a real connection, not just spiritual.
Right.
So we really are his body. And so in the formation of the first Eve, Adam was able to say, this is now bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh. So that was step 1, that she is formed materially connected to the man, right? Bone of his bone, flesh of his flesh. She's formed out of his deep sleep and the opening of his side. The next thing we saw was that she was made, like Adam, free from sin. And we talked about this, I think, in some length, that as Catholics, John, we believe Mary is immaculately conceived, that she was born without sin.
Right.
And
by nature of her son's death on the cross,
the
grace was retroactively taken outside the bounds of time and applied to the moment of her conception.
Exactly right.
Why couldn't God do that?
You're reading my mind again.
Right. Exactly.
This is scary. Stay out of there. It gets weird in there sometimes.
Hey, same here.
Because I actually wanted to talk about that in a moment. But, I think that sometimes those who aren't Catholics find that doctrine a little bit troubling. And when we say that she was free from sin, it sounds like we're making too much of her, or we're making her semi-divine. And so we talked about this a little bit in the last episode, but one of the great ways to think about that is God made Adam and Eve completely free from sin, right? Mm-hmm. Now, they sinned afterwards, but they were made free from sin, and they certainly weren't divine. They were in the image of the divine, but not actually God. And in fact, they were not meant to sin, right? They could have not sinned. That was a possibility. The whole human race could have been free from sin.
That's exactly right. That's
How dare you, Adam and Eve? No,
and this is what Mary shows us, that she also could have sinned.
Yes.
Because she had free will. And there's the mystery of the Immaculate Conception, and there's the relationship between her and the Holy Spirit, but also the power of her normal humanity that isn't, like, let's say Mary wasn't touched by God's, profound grace and somehow didn't receive all of that, which is sadly what some of our Protestant brothers and sisters tend to believe, where they will look at Mary as just a woman God picked out of the masses of women and said, you're going to take care of Jesus
right now.
Right, and I'll give you grace to raise him, but that's pretty much all you got.
Yeah.
And if we go with that, it's still amazing that Mary didn't sin throughout her life and remained a virgin, even in the midst of getting married to her husband and living with him, even after Jesus was raised and out of the house. Yeah. Like, how is that a thing? Now, the danger is, of course, some will say, well, Mary would have possibly also had other children because it said something at a certain point in Scripture where, and his brothers, right? And
did we talk about this in an episode months ago, I think?
Vaguely, I can't quite remember, but
I can't remember.
It's okay if there's some repetitiveness here.
No, I'm just trying to remember. I can't remember if it's on Spirit and Spire, or if it was maybe a class I was doing, because I helped teach the high school classes at my church. It might have been a class I was doing there, but we went and looked pretty in depth into some of this, how the brothers of Christ mentioned in the Bible are not his blood brothers.
Right.
They're not, and the fact that we can actually prove that from the Scriptures, literally prove it from the Scriptures.
That's critical. That's critically important.
It's not just like, oh, we're saying that maybe the Greek word here is being used of cousins. Well, true, it could be, but we're not just saying that. The Bible itself actually proves who those brothers were. And they are not the brothers of Christ.
Right. And see, this points
They're
more
cousins or something else.
to the depth of Mary and Joseph's relationship, their marriage, their ability to, perpetuate that vow of virginity and enter into that. And if she hadn't been preserved from original sin, that's still a monumental feat that deserves incredible honor.
Yeah.
But the fact that that there's truth to the fact that maybe, just maybe, if she hadn't been preserved from original sin, would she have been fully capable of doing that, right? Original sin does affect us in some way.
It does. It darkens the intellect, weakens the will.
Exactly, but she always had the fullness of her intellect, the strength of her will engaged.
And you talked about her being preserved from original sin. I think that's good to point out as well to those who don't hold the Catholic teaching on her Immaculate Conception, is the fact that obviously, Mary had nothing to do with her being immaculately conceived. All the glory goes back to God. It's not like she pre-existed her conception and said, I'm going to make myself immaculate, right? That's impossible.
Right.
But the point is, she would have contracted original sin because she was part of the race of Adam. She would have contracted original sin. She would have committed actual sins after that. Like, that's pretty much a guarantee.
Yes.
Had it not been for the work of God. But yeah, that I think was a good chunk of what we talked about last time. We did get into a couple of interesting topics, but I thought maybe super quick we could talk about the other bullet points, just list them off, about the first Eve.
I'd say that's good.
And then we can think about how they relate to Mary. If we have time, I'd love to dig into what's called the Proto-Evangelion, that awesome bit in the second chapter of Genesis that prophesies the coming Messiah.
Now, before we do all of that,
you first.
I want you to tell me what this is.
Well, this is a pretty fascinating object.
Lift it up.
Okay, so some of you are just listening to this right now, maybe like on Spotify. Some of you may be watching this on YouTube. So if you're listening, you don't realize what I'm holding up. But I am holding up a very nice microphone right now. So we just got these. They aren't even hooked up. We're not even using them today.
Right.
We haven't even run our tests. But, God has been so good to us on Spirit Inspire that all of this happened. We were able, through just a fantastic gift, to be able to buy the cameras and everything. But one of the things that we have realized now that we've been around for a few months is that our audio quality could be better.
Yes.
And I'm excited to tell you all that in about 2 episodes from now, it's going to be way better.
Get ready, everybody.
Excited. Yeah.
We're very excited about this. But we had to say it because I'm sure everybody, if they were watching, were like, what is that? Why didn't John have one? Like, I feel left out a little bit. I had to make sure.
Here, let me scoot it over to you.
Yay. we're still not using this. See, it's not even plugged in. But it's just exciting.
This literally came out of the box 10 minutes ago.
10 minutes before we started the episode. So here we are. We'll put it on display today. It's great.
It is.
So with that, back to Mary as the new Eve.
Yes.
So let's go through the quick bullet points and jump into this deep topic, right?
So
knowing that we can't ever fully exhaust it.
Absolutely, no. This is part 2. I still hope we can do a part 3, like legitimately, but I think also it could go to like 20 parts, which is probably not going to happen.
Sure.
But so again, the first bullet point we mentioned was about her formation from the side of Adam, right? The second bullet point we mentioned was the fact that she was made without sin. And I forgot we did talk a little bit last time about the fact that she was the wife of but one husband, Adam, right? We did talk about this a little bit last time. And that's important. And she was designed to be that, right? They were meant for each other in God's design. When we look at this stuff, I think it's really important to think about what happened prior to the fall and which events occur after the fall. Because we know that there are things which happen in our world post-fall that we can say, okay, that maybe that's part of God's permissive will, but it's not the way he wanted it to be.
Right,
you know?
And it's pretty clear.
But then if it's something prior to the fall, we can say like, okay, this is exactly how God wanted it to be.
Right.
So one of the things that we realize from reading Genesis that is prior to the fall is the idea of procreation. Adam and Eve are given this command to be fruitful and multiply before they fell. Mm-hmm. And God doesn't make anything pointlessly. So if you look at Adam and Eve, even physiologically, their bodies were designed for procreation, for the giving, and hers for the giving of birth.
Yes.
Well, if that was something that wasn't meant to happen until sin, then God wouldn't have made him that way. So the next bullet point we can realize is that Eve was designed in some way to be bringing children into the world, right? So she's made from the side of the man. She's made without sin. She is designed to be married to this one man, right? They're designed for each other. Right. She's designed to be a mother even before she is, right? That's literally part of who she is meant to be in God's pre-fall plan.
Yes, it wasn't because you fell now you have to give birth to children. Right. It's only the giving birth of children will increase in pain.
Right, and that's what changes.
And a powerful reality, something that I had never heard before, but it was it's based on, because it comes, I'm not a woman. I've never been a woman. Can't be a woman. Never will be a woman. I have no idea what pregnancy will actually
we're told these days we can.
Well, I get that, but people experience great phenomena that we need to slowly
that'll be another
address.
Conversation.
That's its own episode. Rabbit hole, tangent alert right now. But I did hear from someone once about this reality of what pregnancy and labor is, and how Mary could have had a child the natural way without it just Jesus appearing, right, which is, I think, kind of a non-human approach to Jesus and the incarnation. And it's this idea of before the fall, if Eve had conceived and given birth, it would have been utterly painless
Right.
and perfect.
Right.
And the amazing thing is that after the fall, it's not like God redesigned the human body and now all of a sudden it will be painful by nature of how I moved around, like changing the spark plugs or something of
That's
a car.
a good point,
right?
because nothing was changed in their bodies after
Nothing
the
was
fall.
changed
No
in their-
redesigning was
No
done.
redesigning. And so the power of this is that something changed in their hearts and their minds and their souls. And physiologically, what happens to you if you've gone through trauma or abuse or neglect?
Yeah.
There's some level of physiological manifestations
Oh, absolutely.
that have an effect on how you see people, how you think about things, how you act and behave.
can just
Even
like
your
be-
physical health can be affected
Absolutely.
by this. And
You
so,
can even get physical pains. You become tight. You become hunched over. You get migraines.
Yes.
All this kind of stuff
yes,
can play a part
a
of
friend
that.
of mine had a really tough work situation for several years. Management had gotten out of control. It was just a lot of dynamics of leadership had changed over the years. He had been in the industry for probably 20, 30 years. And his back was killing him. He was standing all day. It was just terrible. Until all of a sudden, one day, he just felt this call from God, and he went to spiritual direction. I need to leave the job. He got a different job. His back problems were gone instantly.
Yeah.
All of the things that he had been struggling with were completely not a thing. It had everything to do with the environment he had been in. And again, it happens gradually on some level. But with the fall, I think to myself, physiologically, something was affected, but not because of something God did, but because of something they had done. So all of a sudden their intellects were darkened. They couldn't see. They must have felt horrific shame and guilt, pain, sadness,
that, yeah.
all kinds of regret and despair. And so those things would have some kind of effect on our physiological responses, especially, I imagine, with women giving birth. Think of a woman having a child and the man is not present. Who's abandoned her, neglected her, isn't there for her, even makes her feel bad. There's some level of fear and anger and lack of stability that might expedite complications with the pregnancy on some level that we can't foresee, right?
Yeah.
I wonder to myself if it's a similar experience, but just by nature of being human beings in the fallen world, that women will have pain during childbirth not because of what God did, but because of the fall and how the emotions and the spiritual realities affected us physically.
So I think what you're saying is not so much like it's a curse that God threw on there. It's more like a result or an effect of the falling, which actually, I was thinking we might get to talk about the curse in a moment. So that's kind of interesting. That's an interesting connection there.
But then you think about Mother Mary.
Yeah.
And so she's the new Eve.
Right.
She is preserved from original sin. And there's some level of perfect, again, she has the fullness of her intellect, the strength of her will.
We believe as Catholics that she gave birth to Christ without pain.
Right, and without losing her virginity.
Exactly.
At the same time. And so there's that physical, but yet she could still have literally gone through labor.
Yeah.
Literally had Jesus.
Well, she does spiritually at the foot of the cross.
Right, and then of course she fulfills it in the fullness of time.
And
right?
this is another point of the fact that we believe that she gave birth to Christ without pain. Some may see that and say, look, this is just one more crazy doctrine you Catholics like to add up there about Mary. Why do you have to assume that? No, it flows from our belief in the Immaculate Conception.
Yes.
It flows from the fact that we believe she is a new Eve. Again, go back to Scripture and realize if the pain of childbirth, as you say, was multiplied because of the fall, then we have to say before the fall, that would not have been the case.
Right.
So if you have a new Eve, if you have a woman who is made immaculate, then we should expect the childbirth to be painless because it would be as it were in paradise.
Yes, and I wonder to myself if there is something to the fact that Mary would have been able to give birth without pain, as we teach, but also I'm not going to say if there was any pain with Mary, because we can't say that, right? But with some women, I've heard that there are breathing techniques, there's meditation, there's mindfulness,
Sure, yeah.
and you can actually enter in where it isn't as painful.
Absolutely.
Right? And so that to me only proves more that there is something to that physiological connection between the spiritual world, right? Now, to play devil's advocate with this, well, I actually will never play devil's advocate. I don't even like that phrase. No, let's strike that from the record.
Well, actually, the phrase was, I believe, created by the church as part of the canonization process.
Oh, good. Okay,
Yeah.
well, then I don't feel so bad. But what I'm saying is, it's possible that some of the objections to Mary gave birth without pain is, well, that just takes away from her ability to relate to us as human beings. Just like if Christ was on the cross and he didn't feel pain.
Right.
Okay, well then obviously he can't relate to our suffering. So explain that one, smart guy, right?
So I think, well, let's touch on this briefly and then get back to the bullet points. So I think that there are ways of relating and ways of not relating. Christ, we know, for example, was tested like us at all points, but without sin.
Without sin, right. Well,
If he had not had some sort of natural human nature, he could not have been tested. Right? It's true that he did not sin, but certainly he had to have these experiences which would have led a normal man to sin. Pain, exhaustion, suffering, fear, all these kind of things, right, going on. So he is still able, as it says, we have a high priest who is able to sympathize with our condition, basically. Now, Mary was a human with a human body. She certainly was capable of feeling pain, 100%.
Right.
I'm quite sure that at some point she, cut her hand with a knife in the kitchen sort of thing, right? I'm sure she tripped and fell down. I'm sure that she, various things happened to her, just like they happened to Jesus, right? They were both able to feel pain.
Because even though she's in preserved from original sin, she still lives within the fallen world.
Precisely.
Right.
So I think Mary was fully capable of feeling pain. Possibly, so here's an idea. There's the idea that the more sensitive you are, let's say physically, the more you feel pain, right? And the same is true psychologically. So it's often been said, we know that the crucifixion was one of the most painful deaths we can imagine, and everything that Christ suffered.
Yes.
In fact, I did not even realize this. I learned this quite recently. The word excruciating comes from excrucio, from the cross.
Wow.
The very word excruciating means of the cross because it was considered the most painful kind of death in the Roman world.
Yeah.
But I think we could imagine that there have been some martyrs and some people here and there who have probably suffered deaths that might seem even more grotesque and painful to us. Right? And yet we hold that no one ever suffered as Christ did. And I think that can be held on two reasons. One is due to physical sensitivity. Very interesting thing that I learned recently. So in the Garden of Gethsemane, where Christ sweats blood, that is a known phenomenon that can happen when somebody's facing extreme fear of death. What I did not know about this was it introduces an extraordinary physical sensitivity to pain. I forget the technical scientific name of this phenomenon. Right. So even like a breath of wind blowing across your skin will hurt. And so shout out here to Matt Fradd. I was listening to Pints with Aquinas a while back, and he had on this guy from the Vatican who's a big expert on the Shroud of Turin, and that's where this conversation came from.
Oh, sure.
And the guy points this
that.
out. Yeah, the guy points this out, Father somebody, I don't remember who, that the level of pain would have been greatly increased, at least for that period of time in Christ. And the first touch he received was the kiss of Judas.
Oh my.
The kiss would have actually hurt. Yeah.
Wow.
Pretty profound.
That is so profound. In fact, I had heard a story of a woman who was driving in the car with a friend of hers, and her family, her husband and kids were in the car in front of her, and they were going somewhere, and the car with her whole family inside was in a terrible head-on collision, and she witnessed her entire family die right in front of her. And she had that actual physical phenomena take place where she sweat blood. She was so overwhelmed. And there's something to the fear of death that Christ felt, but also the excruciating agony of loss. Think of his thirst for souls and his longing for love that was completely denied and betrayed by those closest to him. And that was also part of that phenomenon. And there's something to that.
And then we have to think of the spiritual sensitivity of Jesus.
Oh, gosh, yes.
So think about this for a moment. How much are you and I affected by the sin of other people? Well, I think some of that depends on the state of our life. If we're actively engaging in sin, and maybe you hear of a story or watch a movie or something and it doesn't really affect you very much, a saint is going to actually find the witnessing somebody else's sin painful. They're going to feel real sorrow for that soul, right? Well, Christ, being God, is going to feel that to a level that none of us can ever understand. The smallest sin would be of anguish to Christ's soul.
Yes.
Right? So none of us can actually grasp what that is like. So both physically, and I think another thing we can say is here, Christ, who also was without original sin, whose body was perfect and was taken from the flesh of Mary, who was without sin,
right.
His body would have functioned perfectly. So some of us can have defects to where our nerves don't even work right.
Right.
Christ would not have had that issue.
He wouldn't have.
So I think we can actually say Christ physically would have been very sensitive and spiritually beyond anything we can imagine. So in both ways, an ordinary person dying on the cross, we would say, okay, that is one of the most excruciating things we can imagine. But maybe we could imagine one that's a little more excruciating. But when it comes down to Christ, because of his state, there's nothing like it.
Right.
Okay, right? It's beyond any level that the entire history of humanity, every human gathered together and suffering will not approach the level of suffering Christ had on the cross.
Correct.
Okay, well, let's think about Mary.
Right.
She was physically sensitive and spiritually sensitive as well. Mm-hmm. So I think that her pain-free childbirth is something that is important because it speaks of the redemption. It speaks that return to paradise, the new Eve, right? And so it's a natural consequence. So I think God's going to make sure that happens.
Yes.
But he wasn't just saying you're going to have a pain-free life.
Right, because a sword will pierce your heart, and she experienced
this
that.
This is the first thing we hear about
cross.
her, really, after the birth of Christ, is
yes.
A sword will pierce thine own heart too.
Yes, it was almost like the conception, pregnancy, and birth of Christ was like this preserved, beautiful, safe haven.
Yeah.
Even if
and then
it was in the obscurity of Bethlehem in a cave with animals, right?
Yeah.
But yet there was some level of the perfect experience of poverty of spirit
mm-hmm.
and total receptivity to God and the grace that obliterates or preserves you completely from original sin so that you can actually have a little bit of paradise. Because think about being in the garden, animals would have been there. Mm-hmm. Animals would have been present, yeah. Right? There would have been this deep closeness that to God and to one another that no one can take away, and it's similar, I'll say, to a couple giving birth in the hospital room. Even today.
What an amazing experience that is, And
that's something that my wife and I have not experienced yet, and we long for that, right? But it's definitely something that has to be unique every single time.
It's a transformative experience. And yes, it is unique every time, even when you've been through it as many times as I have been.
How many kids again? 8 kids.
And technically I missed one of them. I was there, but that we didn't have a babysitter on that one. And so the next youngest, I was walking around in the hall and couldn't quite make it back in the room for the actual delivery because I was trying to keep her out of the most traumatic bits of it,
Oh, sure.
But I've been in the room for 7 of them and there for 8.
Wow.
But yeah, I think thank you for bringing up the sword shall pierce your own heart line, because what I was trying to go with this is Mary gets other children. Remember, she's given John on the cross to be her son.
Right.
Well, this is in the midst of her watching her dearly beloved son, the most precious thing in the universe to her, dying this horrible death on the cross.
That must have hurt.
And she's completely silent, which is interesting.
Yeah.
Like, that level of silence and the level of, I think, speaks to the level of suffering, right? We don't hear a single word that she speaks at the foot of the cross. We can only imagine what's going on inside of her. But this is where she experiences the pain of childbirth. It's not the physical childbirth of Christ. It is on Calvary that she experiences the travailing the Bible speaks of, the anguish of childbirth, in which she is giving birth to those who would be saved by her son.
Yes.
So she gets
That's it.
And I think that the saints and mystics and everybody would agree that while Mary's suffering was nowhere near Christ, it is still of a level that none of us ever experienced. It was an internal suffering for her, like almost exclusively internal suffering. She is just simply silent at the foot of the cross. She's not bleeding or anything like that, like her son is. There's a mystery there. But the sorrow that she experienced, the devastation of that moment, I don't think any of us can comprehend that.
I couldn't imagine.
She is no stranger to pain. In fact, she understands it better than any of us do. And she therefore understands as a mother, because she had a particular suffering. It wasn't just any kind of suffering. Her suffering on Calvary was the suffering of a mom.
Yes.
So she understands the pain of motherhood better than anybody else does.
You know, I think of the scene from The Passion of the Christ, and I don't know if I mentioned this in the last episode or not, but it's my mom's favorite scene, and it always affected me because of my mom's reaction. Is it when Christ
falls under the cross?
Yes,
it's one of my favorites too.
I have to express it because I know how intense The Passion of the Christ is. Mm-hmm. I also know how controversial it was when it came out because of how violent it depicts his death and suffering, and that many people I know today won't ever watch it again, or they've heard enough about it that they don't even want to watch it and take the risk. And I look at it as like...
I recommend watching it.
Please watch it. I mean, I actually met Father John Bartunek, who was the spiritual guide on the set of The Passion of the Christ a couple years ago. He gave a talk at our first FRP banquet for Family Renewal Project. And I asked him the one question I wanted to know. And he shared what I hoped, because there was an initial marketing of the moment John Paul II, before he died, got to see a screening of the movie. And when he came out of the movie, he said, "It is as it was." And Cardinal Jewish, his personal secretary, sent the email to Mel Gibson and to all who were on the set. And that's what got so many people to hear about it, right? Because they wanted people to know JP2 was saying this. Yeah. Well, the Vatican, as JP2's health decreased over those following months, kind of rescinded that statement and tried to suppress it on some level. And I always wondered what that meant, and it was kind of hard to feel like, okay, well, did he say it? Did he not? And it never was resolved until Father Bartunek said to me, "I saw the email."
Nice. From
Cardinal Jewish. And that, to me, confirms it. And so there's some veracity to that. Like the one of the most influential men in the history of humanity witnessed one of the most influential films and depictions of Christ's death on the cross in the history of humanity. And it is as it was, right? Yeah. And so the moment that I'm referring to with Mother Mary seeing her son, and again, John, the beloved disciple, is with her. He gets her to the front where she could, get close to him while he's still walking.
Yeah, this is along the Via Dolorosa.
Along the Via
carrying
Dolorosa.
The cross.
And she has this, I love how Mel Gibson depicts this. As a mother's heart, she has this flashback to when he's a little boy playing in the backyard, and he falls and scrapes his knee or whatever. And she drops everything that she's cooking or cleaning, and she runs like a mother would to find her. And in the same moment of her running to him as a child, she's also running to him in his broken suffering on his way to the crucifixion.
Right, because he's falling under the weight of the cross, and she has the flashback to him falling as a little child.
Exactly. He's falling under the weight of the cross. She comes to him and said, I'm here. And he says, "Mother, behold, I make all things new."
Yeah.
And it's the music, it's the timing, it's the beauty of and you see as he lifts the cross and walks forward.
It's one of the most inspiring moments. And I love the fact, so I make all things new is from Revelation.
And you want to talk about the new Eve? I mean,
Yeah.
that is the line.
I like the fact that Mel Gibson has that line, or whoever did the actual writings has pulled that from Revelation. Christ does say that. He says it in Revelation, right?
Yes, he does.
But brings it back to that scene because there's this sort of divine incongruity, because it looks like the epic tragedy. He's literally crushed under the weight of the cross. He's covered in dirt and dust and blood and scars and the crown of thorns, right? And he can hardly more than croak out a whisper. And he's like, I make all things new. In that moment of absolute, apparent loss and destruction is when he demonstrates, this is how I redeem it all. It is, yeah, it gets me every time. It's one of the most beautiful
even if
scenes in
it's
the
not
whole
words
movie.
that are biblically written into the script, you have to realize
The
like,
reality
how
is
many-
completely true.
Yes, how many times well, maybe only once or twice, but that's all you need. The apostles said, and Jesus did and said many more things that are written in this book. In fact, if we tried to document it all, it would fill every book in the history of humanity. That means there could have very well, definitely would have. If you're really human, you're going to say some words throughout your life. Joseph and Mary would have said words. Mary would have said things at the foot of the cross that were never written or documented, that weren't necessary for salvation or revelation, right? The same with Joseph throughout his life. He had to teach Joseph or Jesus. He had to be there for Mary. He would have said things out loud, but these words were not recorded because they weren't necessary. In fact, the lack of words in Joseph is what speaks to his strength.
Which is complete. Joseph never says one word in the Bible.
Nothing. And the brevity of what
absolutely
Mary even said, she only said, 7 things that are even recorded in Scripture? The brevity of her speaks to the perfection of what is necessary, right? And that Christ is the one who speaks and teaches and clarifies.
And I think we can realize also, too, that the lives of Joseph and Mary were deeply internal. You know, the thing we hear about Mary over and over is not, oh, she said this and she said that, is she took these things and pondered them.
Right.
Right. She has this very, she's very reflective, right? She's very, there's an internalization of things. I can't imagine her being a super talkative woman, right?
No, probably
I can't
not.
see her chit-chatting and gossiping all the time, right? No, she's, and I can't see Joseph chit-chatting and gossiping. I see these as people who are spending a great deal of their time reflecting on the mysteries of what God had given them and done for them.
Yes.
I think they were probably fairly more the strong silent type, I would imagine.
You speak when you need to speak.
And then it's profound.
And it's profound.
Let's go back to Eve, though, for a moment.
Yes.
That was a great sidetrack, though.
Yes.
It wasn't even a sidetrack.
Well,
That
remember,
fits in
it
perfectly.
wasn't. It got into the depth of,
No,
behold, I make
it's
all things
actually
new.
perfect.
This leads us right into this. So let us hear.
So next
from
bullet
Genesis.
point. Next bullet point. And we also talked a little bit about how, or we can talk a little bit about how Eve is meant to participate with Adam in some of his duties, right? Like having dominion over the world. Okay. Well, this is all pre-fall. So her formation from the side of Adam, her being of one flesh and one bone, being of his flesh and bones, her being designed to be married to him, her being designed to be a mother, her sharing in his dominion over things, her being free from sin, all of this is pre-fall. Something else, because as far as we know, there's nothing said about this till after the fall. She was a virgin at the point of the fall.
That's right.
Just like Mary. Now let's look at the fall. Now, I mentioned earlier how the early church fathers see this connection between Mary and the new Eve. This is one of the things they really focus in on. So 3 things happen at the moment of the fall. First of all, Eve listens to the serpent. The serpent is the devil, in other words, a fallen angel, right? She listens to him. Secondly, she stops believing God. Because remember, God had said, in the day you eat of it, you will die. By the way, he didn't say that to Eve, he said it to Adam. She obviously knows it, so she must have learned this from Adam.
Right.
Adam's the one that seems to have had the really direct statement. In fact, as we mentioned last time, Adam seems to bear far more responsibility throughout this.
Yes.
He not only knew, and perhaps in one sense knew better than she did. St. Paul tells us he wasn't even deceived which means he knew full well what he was doing. And also, it seems like, I think there's a great case to be made that part of his duties involved, protecting the garden. How did the serpent get in there? Right? He's not protecting his wife, right? There's a lot of failure here on Adam's part.
Yes.
Big time.
Yes.
Failures, which I should add, are, I think, something that we as men and women both have their own unique failures they deal with. But I think these are very much examples of areas where we fail as men.
And this is what John Paul II even says in the text of Theology of the Body. He says, man, even though both share in the responsibility in some way, man, it seems, has a special responsibility, as if it depended more on him whether the relationship would be protected or violated, or even if already violated, reestablished.
And that's key, because Catholic theology on the point of original sin says that it comes through the man. So that if Eve had eaten, but Adam had not, original sin would not have been passed on to their children. It was the fall of the man which doomed the rest of all the generations.
Yeah, so it's not play the blame game. It's where was Adam to protect and to provide.
No,
right?
I'm not gonna go down this rabbit hole right now. But if you wanted to actually do some speculation, can you imagine any couple that's ever had more reason to play the blame game and point fingers at each other? Can you imagine the fight they had after this one?
Oh my gosh.
You ate it first.
Right.
No, you knew better. You listened.
And now we have to leave the garden.
You're in the doghouse. Well, you talk to the serpent. Yeah. Anyway, that's all beside the point. Right. So first she listens to the serpent, to the devil, the fallen angel. Secondly, she knows God has said, you will not, if you eat of it, you will die. But the serpent says, no, you won't. And she believes him. So she loses faith in God's word. Okay? And then the next thing that happens is she disobeys God's command and goes ahead and actually eats the fruit. So there's three big things here. She listens, she believes the wrong person, and then she disobeys. Now let's look at the Annunciation. Because her eating of this fruit, Eve's eating of the fruit, is what brought death to the world. The Annunciation, in which Mary receives the life of God into her, in which God becomes incarnate, is what brings life to the world, right? This is the, behold, I make all things new. This is the restoration of all things, right? Yes. That's what's happening there. She listens to the word of an angel. The angel Gabriel in this case. Not a fallen angel, but an angel.
Right.
She believes the word of God. What does Elizabeth say shortly thereafter? Blessed are you who believed
what was spoken to you would be fulfilled.
Exactly. And number 3, she obeys. Be it done unto me according to thy word. Fiat mihi voluntas tua. So the early church fathers made this comparison over and over again. In fact, so many of them did that you almost feel there's a common source. Like, were they all just randomly studying the scriptures and kept picking up on this connection? Or maybe it's an apostolic source,
right?
Maybe. But they kept saying these kind of things. What Eve, doomed through her disobedience, Mary, what Eve tied by her disobedience, Mary unloosed by her obedience, right? And they would make these 3 points. As Eve listened to the word of the devil, Mary listened to the voice of the angel, and they would go, like I just did on these 3 points, and they would set them side by side.
Right? As Christ, or as Adam, disobeyed and gave birth to death, Christ obeyed and brought life for all kind, right?
So the early church fathers saw this. This was kind of like the seedbed or the foundation of how they viewed Mary, was as being the new Eve, the antithesis of everything that came before, in the old Eve. So think about this. If we're going to look at this, we've talked in a previous episode, I think back around maybe Advent, about the angel's greeting of Mary and how it indicates her sinlessness, her full of gracedness, right? And we have good reasons to think of her as being immaculately conceived from the scripture. But then, of course, if she's a new Eve, that makes even more sense, right? So we have to ask this question. What was the reason? And I know we're not going to have a ton of time left in today's episode, but I want to kind of just, I'd love to dig into this for a moment. Can I just kind of focus in on one thing here for a couple of minutes?
Yeah, that's fine.
We might save the Proto-Evangelion for another time, because I think that'll be our third and final episode on this, maybe.
That'll work.
So I'm just going to kind of stop my train of thoughts and back up. In the first couple of chapters of Genesis, there is, according to scholars, two distinct documents put together, two distinct texts, right? And I know you're familiar with this, but in case our audience isn't, if you look at this as a sort of historical critical method, I don't always buy into that stuff, but there's a lot to it as well that can be very good. So we know, though, just looking at Genesis, we have two accounts of creation, not just one.
Right, the wide sweeping view and then the zoomed in version.
Right. And they're complementary to each other, but they are two different separate accounts.
Right.
Well, the scholars who have looked at this, they also realize differences in the language and stuff, and they're like, there also seems to be two different authors here, right? And one of the things that is pointed to is the fact there are two different words used for God. In the one, it is Elohim.
Elohim.
And in the other one, it is Yahweh. And so they have termed these the Elohist source and the Yahwist source, or documents, right? So chapter 1 is the Elohist. Chapter 2 of Genesis is the Yahwist, which is actually the older. Now, I think this is very likely the case, but we also kind of have to be careful. If we look at these as two separate stories and fail to put them together, we run into trouble. Because it is the second story, the Yahwist, which tells us about the creation of woman from the side of man. We could get on a rather chauvinistic, sort of sexist trait here and start saying, well, man's number one and woman was an afterthought, or man was made in the image of God and woman was made in the image of man. Or we could start saying all these things that would kind of denigrate.
But I look at it as the exact opposite. Man was created, and then coming forth from her side came Eve. Notice in no other animals that are male or female did the female come forth from the side of the hippo or the elephant, right? So there was some level of partnership, equality, clear communication here that they are in this together. And yet, at the same time, woman becomes the crown of creation.
She's made last.
She's
Look
made
at the whole
last.
process of creation. Things keep getting better and better.
It's not the
Plants to
afterthought.
animals
It's
to
the
man.
crescendo.
She's
It's the
the
moment
crowning.
things grow from there, right?
Yeah.
I always look at it, and God rested on the seventh day. It wasn't he kicked back on a hammock and said, all right, peace, I'm out. It was more like, and let me tell you the rest of the story, and this is how you participate in the co-creative or procreative redemption of humanity, right?
Yeah.
Man, it's such a powerful reality.
And I think
it's not chauvinistic.
I think there's a lot to be said for her being actually made after Adam. It's kind of like this is the crowning achievement right here.
Yes.
You know?
Yes.
And that's probably why Adam was given certain gifts to protect and defend and all that, right? Not because he was, bigger, better, stronger than her, but was probably given those gifts even physically because of her greatness.
Right. This isn't class warfare.
You protect the most precious thing you know, right?
Yes.
So anyway, all I'm saying is that we could read that text and maybe think that. And this is where names and words are important. As you mentioned earlier, John, the name for mankind is Adam, from the Hebrew Hadam. Later on, that becomes a proper name for Adam. But at first, it's just being used of mankind.
Right.
Once we get down to male and female, we have Ish and Isha. And then Eve is never named until after the fall, until after they're kicked out of the garden.
Right.
Okay, and this is really profound. I hope we get to this. So if we go back to the Elohist text, we have it right there. It says, God made man in his image. In the image of God made he them, male and female he made them. So even the first part of that sentence where it says that God made man in his image is Hadam. It is God made mankind in his image. even if that's all we had, that's enough to say both male and female were made in the image of God. Both have this supernatural element. Both have greater dignity than the animals. Both are this tremendous work of God. But then it goes even a step further and clarifies that male and female, he made them, right?
Yes.
So it's not like Adam, the man, was made in the image of God, and then the woman is like in his image or something lesser. It's very clear when we put the two texts together that both male and female, man and woman, were created completely in the image of God.
I think it's profound that Eve was named after the fall and she conceived after the fall.
It's very profound.
Those are very important elements. So you can say it, oh, well, then she's only fallen and man is not. And male is not, right? And that's not the correct interpretation.
No.
We know that. The reason I believe that this would have taken place would to foreshadow the ultimate redemption, the whole story. I mean, even the fact that God made them clothing and fashion, I mean, he was like the first fashion designer, right? Meant, and how did he do this? It wasn't just fig leaves like Adam and Eve chose.
No, it was
the skin of an animal, which meant death. Blood, sacrifice would have had to take place, which points us to that ultimate sacrifice of Christ on the cross, right? Yeah. In the very, very seed form. But you're looking at Eve having her name after the fall, conceiving after the fall. Mary is preserved from that original sin. And so she's able to conceive within the state of original innocence, original solitude, unity, nakedness before God. She experienced in its fullness, right? Even to the moment she gave birth. And even her name was given to her without original sin.
Yeah.
And Eve was not. And so it's on some level.
That's a very, very profound point.
It's a profound point, and this directly connects the old Eve and the new Eve, so that we can see not Eve was named after the fall and conceived after the fall, therefore women are terrible. That's such a very surface level, shallow view of Scripture that doesn't actually get into the true meaning of what Christ is wanting for us.
Which is, as we've said and seen so far, is the fact that Adam seems to bear the greater responsibility, actually.
Bingo. So Adam bearing the responsibility for causing the suffering of his wife, the increase in child pain, and he didn't even grant her the ability to have children in the garden in paradise. It was after the fall, right?
And even though he knew what he was doing, he also blames her in front of God.
He blames her in front of God, and then he names her after the fact. It's almost like his inattentiveness didn't just start with him letting Eve go off by herself with the serpent.
I think the naming's a little different because, well, I don't know. I've got my thoughts about the naming, but maybe we'll hop back to that in a moment.
This is something that is new, though, for me, that we've unearthed together in this conversation that I think deserves maybe more attention in further episodes, but we'll get there.
Yeah, as I said, what's in a name? That's going to be very interesting.
Maybe that's the title for that one.
It could be. So let's kind of dig in a little bit more here on this. So we've seen these two different texts, and I think they're really important. And so what this is telling us is when we get around to the Yahweh's text, which speaks of the woman being made from the side of man, because we already have chapter 1 showing them in this sort of equality of both being made in the image of God, we have to then say, okay, the Yahweh's text is not trying to show us that the woman is made in the image of man or she's lesser or an afterthought. It is trying to teach us something different. It's trying to teach us something, but it's not that. That's not what it's trying to teach us. Now, it may be trying to teach us several things, but here's where I wanted to go with this, because you kind of brought us there earlier with something you said. Let's look back. You said that God, being outside of time, was able to apply the grace to Mary preemptively, right, before Christ's death on the cross. So let's look back to the story of Adam, who's put into the deep sleep, and the woman is formed from his side. And we've said that this represents the death of Christ on the cross.
Yes.
Now there seems to be an oddity here, because Jesus took his flesh from his mother, Mary, right? And we say God preserved her from original sin, so she even physically was free of the resultant stain of that, whatever that entails, that we would typically pass on from one generation to the next. Right. So that Christ, by becoming incarnate in her womb, was able to take perfect flesh, right?
Yes.
Because he was taking it from the pure flesh of Mary. Okay, fine. That's we can see that, right? That's Catholic teaching.
Good.
But then we're making this whole new Adam and Eve connection. It does seem to really add up, but here's the problem. Eve comes from Adam, and we're making it sound like the new Adam comes from the new Eve, right? Like the
It seems inverted and opposite.
Yeah,
right?
We're saying the new Adam, Christ, took his flesh from the new Eve, Mary, but in the original story, it's Eve who gets her flesh from Adam, from the side. But here's the point.
Right.
If we're making this connection, which I think is completely correct, between the deep sleep and the opening of the side of Adam with Christ's death on the cross, now let's think about this a little differently. The only way that Mary could have been preserved from original sin, in both her soul and her body.
And therefore given her flesh to him, right?
Precisely.
The only way.
The only way that she could have had pure, immaculate flesh to offer to her Creator was because of the death and opening of the side of Christ on the cross.
Bingo.
Okay? So, since God ordained for Christ to enter the world at a particular time, then anyone he was related to in the flesh was going to have to have preceded him in time. Okay? That's just logic. Like,
Right.
that has to happen.
That's the human timeline,
Right.
right? If you drew a straight line.
So in the order of time, Jesus took his flesh from Mary. But in the order of grace, Mary took her flesh from Christ.
Yes.
Which is exactly the same as happened with the first Adam and the first Eve. And it is, you think about the whole bride of Christ, are we made from the side of Christ? Well, no, we're redeemed, right? We're already made from our parents and God doing all that, right?
Correct.
But we're not actually the bride of Christ until we've been redeemed, until we've been washed, until we've been cleansed.
She already was so by nature of her conception. Even still when she was still in the womb of her mother Anne.
Yeah.
She actually, and here's a fascinating thing biologically, women, when they're in the womb of their mother and they're still, babies growing as fetuses, right? At like 2 or 3 weeks in or less, I don't know how they study this or find this out. Maybe a few weeks later, it could be 8 or 16 weeks gestation. A woman, when she's still in the womb of her mother, has all the eggs she will ever have already produced inside of her body. Now, as she grows in the womb and then is born, many of those eggs die, and by the time she's ready to actually become a mother herself in teenage years, it's reduced even further, and then she only releases one a month, right? So that's the natural cycle. But the fact that she has all the eggs she will ever have, whereas men are able to produce sperm more than once, right? This is an incredible phenomenon, which means Mary, still in the womb of her mother, would have had the egg, the physical egg that would have been imbued with the Holy Spirit.
Wow.
15 years later.
And I'm going to guess that was probably the only one she had.
Probably.
Yeah, yeah.
But I don't know, because
Who knows?
we weren't biologists 2,000 years ago.
It's
not
all
powerful?
miraculous, so who really knows how God chose to do that.
Correct.
So I want to really emphasize this. I really do, because if Adam could look at Eve and say, "This is now bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh," it is somehow, there's a cause and effect going on here, right? Eve is related to Adam. The woman is related to the man. But we know that the man was created in the state of original innocence, original justice, right?
Yes.
Not in the fallen state that we know.
Right.
Original sin had not yet occurred. So it is by virtue of Adam's perfect flesh that when Eve is built out of his side, that her flesh is also perfect. So Adam is saying there's an identity here. Our flesh is the same, our bones are the same, right? So there's no possible way at that moment, of course, we know sin hadn't entered the world, but there's no way that we could have looked at that moment and say, okay, Adam, you're all perfect, but this Eve that just came out of you is made of totally different material. She's made of fallen, sinful.
Right, that doesn't make any sense.
No,
right.
Clearly she had the same flesh, the same bones that Adam had.
Yes.
So look now to the new Eve and the new Adam. Bone by bone, flesh of my flesh, formed from his side on the cross, which means that because Christ did not have original sin, Christ's flesh was pure, the new Eve, had to be. She sprang forth from his side the same way that Eve sprang forth from Adam's side. Now I'm going to give an objection that would push back on this. Okay, somebody might say. Cool argument, but you all say that the bride of Christ, the whole church, comes out of his death, his passion, the opening of his side on the cross, right?
Right.
And not all of you guys were made without original sin. Fair enough. But we are also, when we're in our state of sin, before being washed, we are also not the bride of Christ.
Right.
When we are becoming the bride of Christ, we get baptized.
It's
those
baptism
sins, original sin gets washed away. So we are, yes, we too, as the church, are formed from the side of Christ. Yes, we pre-exist that in our fallen state. But actually, original sin is removed from us for us to actually be the bride of Christ. So the opening of the side of Christ, the passion on the cross, the creation of his bride, actually entails the removal of original sin.
Yes.
That's kind of what it means, in a sense.
But without taking away the effects of concupiscence on some level.
Right.
And that's a mystery,
Right.
because it's like, I would really like it to just wash away even my capacity to
Sure.
sin or to fall into temptation.
Then we wouldn't develop virtue, I guess.
But we wouldn't develop virtue or really be able to exercise true freedom, right?
Right.
And so we have to learn that. But somehow Mary was preserved both from original sin and the effects of concupiscence, to where she actually would even tend toward sin. Right?
So I think
Which are two distinct things, I suppose.
I think this is a difference is, Adam has his bride Eve. There's a collective and there's an individual. When we enter into the reality of being part of the bride of Christ, our original sin gets washed away. So there is a connection in idea between being the bride of Christ and being free of original sin. Okay, that's there. But I think that because we have this flesh of my flesh, bone of my bones thing, then I think that the woman who in real time on earth actually shared his flesh, which was Mary, then did Christ give her new flesh when she was 14 years old? No, that's silly. He didn't be like, okay, you've had this body all this time and now I'm going to take it away.
Right.
That can be true of us, right? Born thousands, hundreds of years later, sinners born in a state of original sin, and then we get baptized and original sin is washed away. Awesome. But in the case of the bone of his bone, flesh of his flesh, his actual mother, because they did share DNA.
Yes.
They did share the same flesh.
They still had each
Then
other's
we have
blood
to
vessels,
say-
blood cells in each other.
I think we have to say, I think it's definitive, really.
Mm-hmm.
We have to say that like Adam, she is of his flesh, she comes forth from his side, pure physically as well as in her soul, right? Free from stain, pure flesh, untainted by original sin. She had her flesh. It's the same flesh she had the moment she was conceived in St. Anne's womb, which means from the moment of her conception, apparently in St. Anne's womb, she literally was coming out of the side of Christ on the cross.
Yes!
That's what happened.
That's what was happening right there. And
Yeah.
this is how profound it is that Adam allowed, in his inattentiveness, his lack of protection, and whatever would have led this, Eve eats of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, gives it to Adam. They blame each other on some level. It's just this terrible fall. And then she conceives. Then she receives her name. It's almost like her coming forth from the side of Adam brought this original innocence and purity and perfect, unblemished, body, but then stained through inattentiveness, neglect, grasping, right?
Yeah.
All of those things that are sins. The 7 deadly sins perhaps would have been all of them at the same time happening. I'm saying this is because what Adam did that resulted in Eve receiving her name and her child in the state of fallenness is the exact opposite of what Christ did to Mary at the foot of the cross, to give her a new identity, a new name, not necessarily new flesh, but yet also mystically, yes, she was receiving new flesh, not in the moment she's standing at the foot of the cross, but because of the moment she's standing at the foot of the cross.
Because of it, right.
She receives the grace, not because of her own action standing there. It was just pure grace from God. It is an utter mystery. Christ being the new Adam, giving Eve, Mother Mary, rather, the new Eve, her ability to conceive spiritual children.
And the name of Eve, and this is where I think we'll go next time, when we look at the Proto-Evangelion, the name of Eve means the mother of all living.
Right.
She has been woman up until this time. Isha, woman, woman, woman. The moment she gives birth to a son, she gets called Eve. Now, I want you to notice one thing here. Both of her names were given her by Adam. This is, as far as I know, it's usually parents name their children, but there were no parents to Adam and Eve.
Right.
As far as I know in the history of the world, unless there's some very peculiar little culture I've never heard of, the only case where the husband names his wife, right? And again, this seems like super like sexist, right?
Right. It sounds that way.
He names her woman first of all, so he's the one who sort of like tells her
But there's
identity.
no one else to give a name.
Right.
Right.
And then after she has a child, a son, he names her the mother, right? But again, I think this has a much bigger picture.
Mother.
Because
mother.
Jesus,
woman.
the new Adam, keeps calling her woman in the
is so
Gospel
good.
of John.
Yes.
Until they're at the foot of the cross when he gives her John to be her son, and then he calls her mother.
Yes.
Right.
It goes.
Woman, behold your son. Son, behold your mother. So in this moment of the Passion, the new Adam who gave the new Eve her name to begin with, woman. This means new woman. This is the recapitulation of paradise, of Adam and Eve. The new man is calling the new woman, woman. This is not a slur. This is a compliment, right? And then when she gives birth in the spiritual agony on Calvary to the rest of the living, who are the living? Not the physically living, but the spiritual living. Christians, the redeemed, the baptized, the born again. Right? Then he says, mother, you are now a mother, right?
It's that, to me, that gives us the absolute clear distinction between the new Adam and the new Eve, more so than I think I've ever. I mean, there's lots of different typology that we've been going through in, succession. I mean, a whole litany of typology that can help add to the evidence of this.
Sure.
But to me, that moment right there, where Eve was Isha before the fall, and Eve after the fall, only by nature of her giving birth to children, and that's a movement from woman to mother, and suddenly,
and it is her man who names her.
Who names her? Right? It is Adam who names her, and so Christ as the new Adam. Christ as the new Adam is the one who then names and moves from mother to woman, right? And
never does he call her Mary.
Never does he call her Mary.
He calls Mary, the sister of Martha, Mary, right? He calls Martha.
So interesting.
He calls Martha, Martha.
What does the word Mary mean?
Mary comes from the Hebrew Miriam, and that's a complex and profound word. One thing it means is bitterness, which is interesting.
Wow.
Yeah, but that's a whole other topic. I know
it's like the waters of Mara. Right?
Yeah, I know you've got, there probably is a linguistic connection between Mara and Miriam there with the waters of bitterness. I know you've got limited time, but since we're going to have to kind of close this in about 2 minutes, I had two thoughts.
Yep.
One is super quick recap. What did we see? Adam, woman taken forth from his side, Eve, right, bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. She is meant to be his spouse, and only his spouse, no infidelity, no multiple partners, no divorce, no, one of them dies and remarries again, none of that stuff.
Right.
And if you remember, John, our last episode on this, we talked about how since Mary's spouse is God, we can't have expected her to have had children with Joseph, hence the perpetual virginity.
Correct.
Right? Which means all of her children, because all of Eve's children were the children of Adam, right? So who are all of Mary's children but sons of the new Adam? Right?
Exactly.
Eve was the mother of all the living. Mary is the mother of all the sons of all the children of the new Adam, all the spiritually alive. Wow. Right? That is why we call her the mother of the church, the mother of Christians.
Yes, because she would have had no children with any other man.
It's just God, right?
Just God.
So we saw that Eve was formed from the side of Adam. She was to be his only spouse. She was actually designed before the fall to be a mother. We saw she was going to share in his dominion. Don't we see Mary as a queen in heaven in the book of Revelation? Because of Jesus, he's the king, but a king who loves his wife, his queen, and who trusts her, is very happy to share his power with her.
Yes,
right?
and it's so, it's such a hard thing to hear because Joseph, we often think, well, he got the short end of the stick. No,
Not
he
really.
didn't.
We call him the second greatest saint.
Yes, right. It's like
pretty awesome.
It's not about competition. Again, it's not the Marxist principle of class warfare. I think that is so deeply embedded in our psyche sometimes that the rich are pitted against the poor, liberals against conservatives, traditional versus progressive, or whatever, man versus woman.
Oh, yeah.
And it's not true. This is not it.
It's completely complementary.
It's completely complementary. And so the masculine principle that all men can relate to, can strive toward, is embodied in St. Joseph's ability to be humble.
Yeah.
Before the bride, to
humble,
to elevate
pure,
her, to
faithful, everything. That's real masculinity.
Utterly, completely given over to the ultimate masculine principle, who is God the Father, acting in the life and body of his betrothed, and him humbling himself enough to get out of the way and let the ultimate masculine principle pervade the created world instead of the masculine principle we oftentimes assert through our own dominance of domination, manipulation, power, chauvinism, all of that.
This is like super crass sort of stereotypical example. But I do think that to some extent in modern times in our culture, we associate masculinity with things like, drink a beer, read a dirty magazine, and get in a fight. Right. And the reality is, and unfortunately, there has been enough of that, and we've all been guilty of various abuses of our masculinity.
Correct.
That it's not just that men may think that's masculinity, but also women are going to see that as masculinity. And I hate to say this, but they have good reasons to see that because they've seen so many really bad examples of that.
Yes.
What we need to remember is that Joseph, and you and I were talking about this prior to this podcast today, Joseph is none of those things, but he's the ultimate example of masculinity. He actually is like the icon of perfect human masculinity, and we don't see him doing a single abusive, nasty, dirty, dominant sort of thing ever. He is humble. He cares for his wife and his child, his stepchild. He is pure. He is self-controlled. Right? He is a guardian, a guide when needed. He knows also how to listen when he's wrong about what he thinks about his wife, right?
He's not afraid of hard work. He loves
Everything about
adventure,
this man,
obviously.
Everything about this man is beautiful, but there's no toxic masculinity. It's real masculinity.
Yes.
So anyway, real quickly.
Last point, and then we'll wrap up.
So let's see, we had made from the side of Adam, we had a spouse of Adam, mother of all the living. Eve was made without sin. She was a virgin at the time of the fall, which came about through listening to the fallen angel, believing his word instead of God, disobeying God. Mary was made without original sin. She was a virgin at the time she heard the word of the angel. She responded in faith. She believed God and she obeyed God. Right. Now, there's actually episodes more of connections.
Of course.
Which we don't have time to do.
Right.
But hopefully these are some really cool thoughts for people to kind of see how this ties together. But the final thought that I wanted to leave, John, is something that is purely a thought. This is a speculation.
Uh-oh.
I don't know if you've ever thought about this, but kind of popped in my head. It's been like a half thought I've had once or twice, and I don't know where it goes. But I think there's something behind it. So this could be our speculative thought for maybe some future talk. Look at the other garden. I'm talking about Gethsemane. We've got the new Adam there, right? He's doing right everything the first Adam did wrong. Because the first Adam didn't protect his bride, didn't kick the serpent out, didn't stop her from eating the fruit or whatever, right? He failed epically.
Yes.
The new Adam, Christ, is in the garden with who? His 12 apostles, who are what? The bride.
The bride.
And what is he doing? Sweating drops of blood. He's in an agony. He's facing his death. But he conforms himself completely to the will of the Father. Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. But nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done. He is willing to go to the death for his bride. Adam wasn't. And this takes place in a garden. How fascinating. We get some people entering that garden, including the betrayer, Judas. That's like symbol of the devil, isn't it?
He
right?
does symbolize the devil in that.
We've got the serpent back in the garden. We've got the Adam back in the garden. We've got the Eve, the collective bride, back in the garden.
Right.
But you know what the weird thing is to me? Eve was formed from the side of Adam when Adam fell into a deep sleep. And I think that since then, we have as men have tended to fail in our duties towards women and towards God's creation in general. Do you remember when they entered the garden, what Jesus told the disciples on more than one occasion? Watch and pray. Does this not sound similar to tend and keep? Have you ever wondered why they were to watch and pray? I've always thought it was for their own benefits, as you know, so you don't enter into the test. But were they supposed to be keeping an eye out for the soldiers?
Huh.
And did they fail completely to do that? And they fell asleep.
Right?
Every single one of them
Because what are
fell
watchmen?
asleep.
Watchmen are the ones who watch to see if there's any enemies approaching. And if they fall asleep on their duty, they could literally lead to the entire kingdom being compromised and taken captive. And this is what happens.
And Jesus comes back and he says, are you still resting and still taking your sleep? So every one of the apostles had fallen asleep. So yes, they're the bride, true, and it's Christ who will die the sleep of death and they'll be saved from his side. But we have a very odd second story going on here of these 12 men, the 12 apostles, also back in this garden, falling asleep, but not in a good way. They're not sacrificing their lives for the other. They're just falling asleep. Right. And they are doing exactly what Adam did. They're letting the snake back in the garden.
Yeah.
So I think there's a very profound connection between Gethsemane and Eden. But I think it's kind of deep, and I don't know where it all goes.
No, I think that's something that we'll need to take into prayer.
I know you like those kind of interesting thoughts.
I do. I love that because it does give weight to...
But you got people sleeping. You've got a bride and a groom. You've got a garden again. You've got death and destruction, a serpent, and all this stuff happening.
It's such a good story.
I think there's a connection there.
You know, and this will be kind of my wrap up, and we'll, I guess, conclude the episode now. But I didn't know if you had any final thoughts before I throw. You good?
For next episode. Thoughts,
right.
Yeah.
We, of course, will have to have lots of episodes, as we know, to break this deep stuff open, especially as it applies to us. You know, I think that's
because we've been through, about 6 verses of one of the chapters of Genesis?
Yeah, pretty much.
In 2 weeks.
Right. It takes a while. But one thing that you said that I reflected on is the reality of we could spend our entire lives discussing the depth of these details, these simple, brief details, and even the depth of scripture that goes into it. It is so vast that the things we talk about, you can't even remember. Like you could talk about this 5 years ago, and you would bring it up and it'd be like, I've never heard that before.
It seems fresh again.
It seems fresh again. And you could apply that to all kinds of stories and books and things. Like I've read childhood books 20 years later. I'm like, I don't even remember this. I loved it back then. I get that, right? There's that phenomenon. But what I'm getting at is that the difference between those childhood books and any other things you would ever read and remember is that these are real people.
Yes.
This is a real story.
Yes, and we're part of it.
And we're part of this story. And so the reason we spend that kind of time is to delve deeply into the mystery, strengthen our relationship with these very people, because one day we will meet them.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that is where we end for today, everyone. My goodness, there's so much more that we could discuss and share, and we'll have new microphones at that time. I know, I'm so excited. Let us know in the comments, and maybe send us an email and tell us what you think of the new audio setup and everything as we get that established, of course. Not today, because this is still the old way, the old Eve, right?
Right.
And now we're moving toward the new Eve, and I think that's maybe what these conversations help us connect with, right? We always want to bring more beauty, goodness, and truth to you all, and we thank you so much for watching. Today's episode, we just ask that you like, subscribe, share these videos, these stories, these episodes with others, so that the gospel can be shared with as many people as possible. And please continue to pray for us, and we'll be praying for you all. And we'll see you next week on another episode of Spirit and Spire. God bless.